Everyone laughed when a single mother bought a rusty container. But she didn't just build a house, she changed her life. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The trailer smelled of metal, damp wood, and baby powder. Every morning, Lauren woke before dawn, careful not to wake her son, and watched the thin steam rise from the small electric kettle she had bought secondhand. Outside, the air carried the noise of a highway that never slept, a low hum that had become the rhythm of her life. The trailer park was nearly empty this time of year. Those who could afford to leave had already gone south for the winter. The rest, like her, remained because there was nowhere else to go. The walls of the trailer were streaked with condensation. She pressed her hand against the cold aluminum and felt how thin it was, how little it took to keep out the world. Her days followed a quiet, unchanging pattern. She woke the baby, fed him formula, wrapped him in 2 blankets, and placed him in the old stroller she had found behind a gas station. Then she went out to look for work. Sometimes she was hired to paint fences, other times to scrape old plaster or clean up construction debris. It was work that left her back aching and her palms split, but it paid just enough to cover diapers, gas, and rent for the patch of land where her trailer sat. At night, after the baby fell asleep, she sat by the tiny window and looked at the lights of the distant city, wondering how she had ended up here. A woman in her 40s, alone, counting coins in a jar labeled "next month." The baby gave her a reason to keep breathing, but not always a reason to believe. She had been married once, to a man who could build anything but a promise. He had left when the pregnancy became real. The following months had been a blur of paperwork, shut-off notices, and the slow disintegration of pride. Her mother had died just before the birth, leaving behind a toolbox, a rusted pickup, and a silence that still echoed in Lauren's mind whenever she tried to sleep. That night in February, when the heater failed again, she opened her old laptop, hoping to distract herself from the cold. She scrolled through the classifieds, the endless rows of things people sold to survive. Furniture, scrap metal, tools. Then one photo stopped her. It showed a long, weathered shipping container, streaked with orange rust, sitting on cracked concrete. Used 40FT container, $300, must pick up. She clicked the listing, stared at it for a long time. The idea was absurd. And yet, it sparked something. It wasn't a home, not yet. But it was structure. It was something she could touch, measure, change. A blank shell, a second skin. She thought of all the times she had worked construction jobs, watching men with calloused hands turn nothing into shelter. She had learned enough from them, silently, on the sidelines. Maybe she could do this. The next morning, she drove the pickup into town with the baby in the car seat and met the seller. The container was worse than she expected, dented, sun-bleached, its doors creaking like old bones. But the frame was strong, the steel thick. She ran her hand along the cool surface, and a strange calm came over her. When she asked if he would take $250, the man shrugged. "If you haul it, it's yours." She handed over the money. That night, back in the trailer, she stared at the receipt like it was a deed to her future. People at the construction site laughed when she told them what she'd bought. "You gonna live in a tin can now?" one said. Another joked, "Just wait till summer. You'll bake alive." She smiled faintly and didn't answer. They didn't understand. It wasn't about comfort. It was about freedom, the right to build something that couldn't be taken away. 2 days later, a truck delivered the container to the small plot of land she had rented near the edge of town. The driver dropped it with a hollow thud that shook the frozen ground. The sound echoed in her chest. When the truck pulled away, there was only her, the baby in his stroller, and the long, rusted shape against the winter sky. For a moment, she wondered if she had made a mistake. But then the baby laughed, a small sound that broke the wind's monotone whistle, and she smiled. She began by sketching plans on the back of old envelopes. A door here, a window there, a small loft for sleeping, a corner for cooking. She had no training in design, but she had imagination, and that was enough. She borrowed a grinder from a neighbor, spent nights watching tutorials on insulation and framing. By day, she scavenged for materials, discarded wood pallets behind warehouses, leftover glass panes from renovation sites, nails swept up from the ground. The work was slow and brutal. Metal resisted her. Sparks stung her arms as she cut through the walls. The first time she tried to weld a frame, the heat warped the metal. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and every step forward seemed to demand another 2 backward. But when exhaustion came, she looked at the baby sleeping in his carrier and kept going. He was her quiet witness, his tiny breaths measuring the rhythm of her persistence. Money ran out quickly. She took a job cleaning a warehouse at night, pushing a mop under fluorescent light, while her son slept nearby in his stroller. The foreman sometimes looked at her with pity, sometimes with confusion. She never explained. Each paycheck went straight into insulation foam, screws, and boards. Bit by bit, the steel shell began to change. She built a wooden frame inside the walls, lined it with recycled panels, and painted the exterior a soft shade of blue to hide the rust. The wind no longer howled through the gaps. By spring, the space began to feel less like a relic and more like a home. The floor was made of old pine planks she had rescued from a demolished barn. The scent of wood filled the air. One morning, she woke to the faint warmth of sunlight seeping through the cracks she hadn't yet sealed. She decided to cut her first window that day. It took her hours to measure and saw through the steel, her arms trembling with effort. When the final piece of metal fell away, she stepped back, breathing hard, and light poured in. Thin, golden, alive. She stood there with the baby in her arms, watching the light move across the floor, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Stillness that didn't ache. The space glowed like a promise. It was still small, unfinished, imperfect, but it was hers. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of motion. She sealed cracks with caulk, built shelves from pallet wood, crafted a small cradle for the baby. At night, she sat by the open door of the container, the soft breeze moving through the space, and listened to the sound of the nearby train tracks. Sometimes, she thought about all the containers traveling the world, each carrying something valuable, each moving toward a destination. Hers wasn't going anywhere, but maybe, for the first time, she was. As summer came, grass began to grow around the base of the container, softening its edges. The air smelled of soil and rain. She could finally afford a small solar light, and when she switched it on for the first time, the glow filled the room with quiet dignity. Neighbors who had once mocked her now stopped by to ask questions, half curious, half skeptical. She didn't explain much. She simply let them see the progress for themselves. The once empty shell now held warmth, color, and life. Each nail, each cut, each drop of sweat carried a piece of her history. Every humiliation, every loss, every small act of defiance that had brought her here. When she looked at the baby crawling across the wooden floor, tracing lines of sunlight with his tiny fingers, she realized that what she had built was more than a shelter. It was proof. Proof that starting from nothing wasn't the same as ending there. By the end of the season, the container had become a home, humble but steady. Lauren stood outside one evening as the sun set behind the distant hills. The metal walls glowed softly in the light, no longer a symbol of decay, but of endurance. She whispered to herself that this was only the beginning. Inside, the baby stirred in his sleep, and the small lamp flickered on the wall. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by her circumstances. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and the promise of something larger than survival. She looked at the container, at her hands, at the dirt beneath her feet, and felt a quiet certainty. She had built the foundation not only of a house, but of a new life. And though no one else knew it yet, the woman who had once been laughed at for buying a rusted box had just built the first walls of her future. The first winter in the container had been cruel, but it had also been the season that taught Lauren how to survive without waiting for permission. When the snow began to melt and the grass started pushing through the frozen ground, she no longer looked at her home as an accident of desperation. It was still rough at seams, imperfect, its walls patched with layers of paint, but it had become something real. She could close the door at night and know that the space within those walls existed because she had refused to surrender. The trailer park was far behind her now. The container stood alone, surrounded by the quiet fields at the edge of town, where the only sounds were wind, birds, and the far hum of passing trains. She woke every morning to the soft rustle of her son turning in his cradle, and the pale light filtering through the window she had cut with her own hands. Spring came slowly. The cold retreated reluctantly, leaving puddles and mud that stuck to her boots. She had started a small vegetable patch near the door, just a few rows of lettuce and beans. Nothing grand, but enough to make her believe in growth again. Every coin mattered. She worked wherever someone would hire her, painting porches, cleaning yards, scraping paint from old fences. She learned to barter her labor for what she needed. A few hours repairing a neighbor's roof earned her a roll of insulation. Painting a storage shed gave her an old heater. People who once smirked at her now asked how she managed to make the place livable. She answered simply that she kept working. There were nights when exhaustion pushed her to the edge. Her hands ached from hammering, her shoulders burned from carrying boards, and the baby would cry at the worst moments. Hungry, cold, lonely. She would stop, take him into her arms, hum to him until his breathing softened, and then go back to her tools. She measured progress in inches, not miles. A sealed crack here, a new board there. Slowly, the draft that used to whistle through the walls grew faint. The container began to hold warmth, the air inside thick with the scent of pine and paint. By early summer, Lauren had managed to install a small solar battery and a single light fixture that illuminated the entire interior with a golden glow. When she switched it on for the first time, she almost cried. The light reached every corner, the cradle, the shelves, the patched floor, and made the space look larger than it was. The baby clapped his hands, his laughter bouncing off the metal walls. For a long time, she simply stood there, watching the light tremble, feeling that she had turned rust into radiance. The transformation did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as she was sanding the doorframe, a young man stopped by on his bicycle. He introduced himself as a blogger, someone who filmed unusual homes. He asked if he could take a few pictures. She hesitated, embarrassed by the cracks, by the simplicity of everything she had built. But he smiled and said that what mattered wasn't how it looked, but what it meant. The video he posted a week later showed her container shining in the sunset, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. Within days, people started leaving comments, some admiring, some skeptical, but all curious. Messages began to arrive in her inbox. Strangers offered to donate materials. A few even asked if she could help them turn their own containers into houses. At first, she ignored the messages. She was no architect, no entrepreneur. She was just a woman who had done what she had to do. But one letter changed her mind. It came from an elderly couple who had lost their home in a flood. They had an old school bus, and a dream to make it livable again. "We saw what you did," they wrote. "Would you consider helping us?" She read it several times, unsure if she was capable. Yet something inside her whispered that she couldn't say no. She met them 2 weeks later. The bus was parked behind a warehouse, its paint faded, its seats ripped out. She stood inside, breathing in the smell of dust and oil, and saw possibility. Over the next months, she worked on that bus the way she had worked on her own container. She welded, painted, built cabinets from scrap wood. Sometimes she took her son with her, laying a blanket for him in a quiet corner while she worked. The couple visited every few days, bringing her coffee and food, watching in awe as the wreck transformed into a small, moving home. When it was finished, they hugged her, crying softly. The payment they gave her was more than she had earned in months, but what mattered most was the look of gratitude on their faces. Word spread quickly. People who had watched her video now had proof that she could build more than one home. A man asked her to repair a storm-damaged shed. Another wanted a container turned into a studio. Each project was different, but every nail, every board, carried her determination. She used the money to buy better tools, a second-hand drill, new blades, gloves that didn't tear after a week. Her body adapted to the rhythm of labor. Her muscles grew stronger, her movements more precise. The sound of the hammer became as natural to her as her own heartbeat. As the months passed, the land around her container turned into a workshop. There were piles of wood, buckets of nails, and stacks of panels leaning against the fence. Neighbors began stopping by, not out of curiosity, but respect. Some brought her extra materials. Others asked if she could teach them. She realized that she was no longer just building homes. She was building trust. It was around that time that she met the 2 people who would become her first workers. The first was a man named Eli, who had been living in his car for nearly a year after losing his job. He came one morning offering to help in exchange for food. His hands were rough, his voice quiet. She gave him a hammer and told him to start by removing rusted nails from old boards. He worked all day without complaint. By evening, she decided to keep him. The second was a woman named Rose, recently divorced, who came asking for odd jobs. She had never built anything in her life, but she learned fast, sanding and painting with careful precision. The 3 of them formed a small, unspoken alliance, each one broken in different ways, yet held together by the work that demanded patience and effort more than words. Together, they started taking small commissions, repairing sheds, converting garages, turning forgotten spaces into something alive again. They worked from dawn till night, laughing sometimes, silent often, but always moving forward. The baby, now a toddler, toddled between piles of wood, his laughter mingling with the clatter of tools. He grew up surrounded by the smell of sawdust and sunlight, his mother's calloused hands guiding his first steps. The more Lauren built for others, the more she understood what she had truly created for herself. The container had not just given her shelter, it had given her identity. She was no longer a woman who had been abandoned, or a mother scraping by on borrowed kindness. She was a builder, someone who could take decay and turn it into hope. Her neighbors began to refer to her place simply as the home on the edge. By autumn, she could look around and see tangible proof of everything she had done. The small porch she'd added, the new rain gutter, the climbing vines softening the steel walls. Inside, the floor was warm under her feet, and the windows opened to the scent of pine. On quiet evenings, she would sit outside with her son on her lap, watching the orange sky fade into violet. The fields rustled, and somewhere far away, a train passed, echoing softly in the distance. When people asked her how she had managed it all, she said she had never planned to. She just started, and the work carried her forward. The hardest days had not been those of labor, but of silence. When no one believed in her, when the noise of doubt filled her head. Now that noise was gone. In its place was the hum of tools, the laughter of workers, and the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt piece by piece. The home she had made from a shipping container had become a symbol without her realizing it. Others began to see in her what she had once been unable to see in herself. Proof that a person could rebuild not only walls, but dignity. She started receiving invitations to local fairs, community events, even a small feature in the town newspaper. The attention embarrassed her, but she understood its value. Each time she stood beside her home, she represented the possibility of beginning again. One evening, after her crew had gone and the sun had set behind the hills, Lauren sat alone outside her container. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and grass. Her son slept inside, his small breaths rising and falling in rhythm with the night. She looked at her hands, scarred, rough, but strong, and realized they no longer trembled when she held her tools. The darkness around her no longer felt empty. It was simply the space between days, waiting to be filled with whatever she would build next. The transformation from metal to home was complete, but Lauren knew it was only the beginning. She had built not just for herself, but for something larger, a belief that no life, however broken, was beyond repair. The container that had once been a cage of rust had become the foundation of everything she was becoming. The quiet land at the edge of town now pulsed with the steady, invisible heartbeat of possibility. She rose, turned off the light, and looked once more at the outline of her home against the night sky. Tomorrow there would be more work, more hands to guide, more walls to raise. For now, it was enough to know that she had created something enduring. The woman who had once been laughed at for dreaming of a home inside a box was now building homes for others. The wind moved softly through the fields, whispering around the steel walls, and she smiled, certain that even metal could remember warmth. Years later, when the mornings came with the soft hum of machinery instead of silence, Lauren still remembered the cold air that used to seep through the seams of her first container. It was impossible to forget the smell of wet earth, the sting of frost, and the metallic echo of her own footsteps on a floor that hadn't yet become a home. Now, that same floor rested inside a restored structure, preserved as a symbol of what she had built from nothing. Her workshop had grown from a corner of an empty field into a living space of creation, filled with the rhythm of saws, hammers, and voices that once had no place in the world but here. The small blue container still stood behind it, quietly watching over everything that had come since. The workyard stretched across the edge of the town, a mixture of metal, wood, and possibility. Piles of reclaimed materials formed a kind of sculpture in themselves, silent monuments to transformation. Trucks came and went, carrying not only supplies, but also the proof that her idea had survived its doubt. The team had grown. 5 workers now, each with a story marked by loss or resilience, each drawn to the calm certainty in her manner. She arrived before dawn most days, walking across the gravel with a mug of coffee that steamed in the cool air, her son, no longer a baby, often walking beside her, his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder before school. He had grown up surrounded by the sound of construction, the scent of sawdust, the sight of his mother always in motion. Her name had become known in the nearby towns. What began as curiosity, a woman building her own house out of a shipping container, had turned into respect. She was invited to local panels about sustainable housing, asked to consult for small organizations, even interviewed on the radio. The attention never quite felt real. She still saw herself as that same woman who once bartered her labor for scraps of insulation. Yet when she spoke about her work now, her voice carried a quiet confidence that came not from pride, but from understanding. She had learned that building something lasting meant more than laying boards and pouring paint. It meant teaching others how to see possibility where the world saw ruin. When the city announced its new housing initiative, a project to turn the abandoned industrial district into affordable homes, she almost didn't apply. The competition included architects with degrees, firms with investors, teams with glossy portfolios. But her employees insisted. "You've already done it," one of them told her. "You've been doing it for years. You just never called it a project." She stayed up all night drafting her proposal by hand, sketching out simple, modular homes made from containers and reclaimed materials, each design grounded in practicality and empathy. She wrote not like an architect, but like someone who knew what it felt like to have nowhere to go. Weeks passed without a word, and she convinced herself it was over. Then, one morning, a letter arrived with the city's seal. Her proposal had been accepted. They wanted her team to lead the pilot phase, a small community of container homes for low-income families. She sat at her desk for a long time before she allowed herself to believe it. The paper trembled in her hands, not from fear, but from the weight of every night she had worked under a single flickering light, while her child slept beside her. Construction began in early spring. The lot was a graveyard of concrete and rust, filled with weeds that had grown through cracked asphalt. But where others saw decay, she saw foundation. She mapped out the site with chalk, her boots leaving faint prints in the dust. Her crew worked tirelessly, assembling walls, cutting openings, sanding wood. She oversaw every detail, often working long after the sun went down, the hum of generators filling the air like a lullaby to her persistence. One afternoon, she stood by the first nearly finished unit, a simple, sunlit space with white walls and wide windows. The smell of paint and warm steel mingled in the air. A woman, one of the future residents, approached with tears in her eyes, whispering that it felt like hope had a shape again. Lauren smiled, not knowing what to say. Words had never been her strength. Her language was built from wood and nails, from sweat and silence. The project grew faster than anyone had predicted. Local news stations came to film, calling it a revolution in affordable living. But for her, it was never about innovation. It was about restoring dignity, giving people what she had once begged the world for, a place of their own, however small. She walked through the half-finished homes at night, hearing echoes of laughter that would soon fill them, imagining children's drawings on the walls, the hum of evening meals, the weight of safety settling in. Her son often visited after school, helping with small tasks, sketching on the backs of blueprints. He was taller now, quiet like her, but his eyes held a brightness that came from growing up inside his mother's story. Sometimes she caught him looking at the old blue container behind the workshop, the one she refused to move. "That's where it all started," she told him one evening. "And it'll stay here until I'm gone." He nodded, touching the cool steel as though he could feel the years within it. Months later, the first phase of the project was complete. Rows of neat, colorful homes stood where there had once been only rust and neglect. The mayor came for the opening ceremony, shaking her hand and thanking her for her vision. Cameras flashed, people clapped, and she stood awkwardly, her palms still marked with calluses. For her, the applause was less a celebration and more a strange kind of silence, the moment when she realized how far she had come from that cold trailer where everything had begun. After the ceremony, she slipped away to the back of the site, where the old container had been placed as a display, polished and repainted, but unchanged in shape. The door was open, and she stepped inside. The interior had been left almost as it was, bare metal walls, a single window, the faint smell of wood still lingering. A plaque on the outside called it the first home. People would come to see it, take pictures, tell stories about the woman who had built an empire of homes from a box. But to Lauren, it wasn't a monument. It was a memory made solid, the sound of her own beginnings sealed in steel. She sat on the floor, tracing the lines of the window frame, and thought about all the versions of herself that had lived within these walls. The one who had been afraid, the one who had been hungry, the one who had dared to keep going anyway. The air inside was warm, almost breathing with her. She closed her eyes and listened to the faint voices outside, to the wind against the metal, to the echo of her son's laughter from somewhere near the workshop. When she stepped out again, the sky was turning gold. Her team was gathered nearby, finishing the final touches on another home. They looked up as she approached, smiling, waiting for her next instruction. For a moment, she saw them as she had once seen herself, people at the edge of something new, uncertain but unwilling to stop. She told them to rest early, but she stayed behind, watching the sunset stretch across the horizon. The city skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, and she thought about the thousands of people who still didn't have a place to belong. There would always be more work to do. But now she understood that what she had built wasn't just walls or roofs. It was a movement of hands, of hearts, of will. As night fell, lights flickered on across the new community, warm squares of yellow against the fading blue. She walked through the narrow paths between the homes, hearing laughter, the creak of doors, the sound of families settling in. Each house carried her fingerprints, her labor, her story. It felt like walking through a living memory. When she finally reached the end of the row, she turned to look back. The lights shimmered like stars scattered across the earth. She thought of the first night she had slept inside her container, the darkness thick and uncertain. That night, the wind had been her only companion. Now, the air was alive with life. Lauren returned to her workshop, where the machines had gone quiet for the evening. She placed her tools neatly on the bench and turned off the main light. Through the window, she could still see the faint outline of her first home in the distance, the steel glowing softly under the moon. It stood not as a reminder of struggle, but as proof that nothing was wasted. Not a nail, not a moment, not a dream. She sat for a while, letting the silence settle around her. Then she whispered to herself the words she had carried for years, the words that had become her truth. Iron rusts if it stands still, but if you heat it with heart, it becomes a home. And as she rose to leave, the night carried her voice into the quiet, wrapping it around the place that had once been nothing more than a rusted box, now the heart of a community that would keep growing long after she was gone. Subscribe for more real stories. Watch the next video and share this one with someone who believes every home has a story.